मानव का जीवन मिला रे, धर्म मिला अनमोल, अब श्रद्धा से यत्न से.
Before we get into today's show, I just want to add a quick reminder that any donation given to our nonprofit, Better Burma, will be shared directly with those in Myanmar who need it most. Any and all donations make such a difference right now. Go to insightmyanmar.org/donation if you would like to contribute, or stay tuned to the end of the episode to hear more options. With that, let's get on to the show. मन की गांठें खोले, मानव जीवन. And I'm pleased to be talking to Tamara Edwards. She is the center manager at Dhamma Pabha. That's a vipassana center in the Goenka tradition in Hobart, Tasmania, in Australia. And we met in Australia as well as Myanmar and have a chance to reflect on some of the experiences going to meditate and be in some of the monastic environments in Myanmar. So Tamara, thanks so much for joining us here.
Thank you, Joa. It's really a pleasure to be speaking with you again.
Yeah, so some hard times right now in Myanmar, obviously. We're all following them closely. But the nature of this conversation is to balance some of that heaviness and reflect on some of the warmer memories and the appreciation, the gratitude that so many of us have of spending time in the country as well as the influences of the country. So can you give us a bit about your background and how you got into Vipassana meditation and how that eventually brought you to Myanmar?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's not a very exciting story. I think Vipassana was just, like for many people, I guess, something that I was just destined to do, but I'd never done any prior meditation at all and never imagined myself to do so. And I ended up travelling in India in the late 90s and not necessarily on a spiritual quest, but ended up meeting a woman from New Zealand there, actually, who has remained a very close friend of mine to this day. And she'd just come off a course. It was New Year's Eve and we were staying in a hotel in Gujarat, and she'd just come off a course at Mandvi and told me then for the first time about Vipassana. And serendipitously enough, we continued to meet up in random places on our travels, and I finally ended up staying with her in Nepal. Her husband was going off to do his first course in Kathmandu, and I suddenly decided there and then that I needed to go off and do that course as well. But unfortunately, my travel plans had already been made and I was to fly back to India before the course ended. So I ended up spending the 2 weeks there with her, learning more about Vipassana and feeling very strongly that it was something I needed to do. And she said, oh, well, look, don't worry. There's centres in Australia and you'll find one in Melbourne. So I returned home and ended up doing my first course at Dhamma in Melbourne and haven't looked back.
Oh, that's great. What years was that you were in India and then took your first course?
I met this friend in about 1998 and didn't end up taking my first course until a few years later in 2001.
Oh, that was my first course as well, July 2001 in
Oh,
Japan. Yeah, and I
really?
was living in Japan, and I also was alternating between, do I take it in Japan or do I take it in India? Because I was just taking my first trip to India, and I had a 6-week break from school because I was teaching at the time. So I ended up taking, of those 6 weeks, I took the first 2 weeks taking a course at Dhamma Pabha in outside of Kyoto, Japan. And then as soon as that course ended, then flew to India for the first time, and then had the following 4 weeks in India with that quite a changed transformation that was was bringing me there after that first experience. So
Absolutely. Yes, India pre-Vipassana and post-Vipassana are two very different experiences.
I'm sure, and I never knew it pre-Vipassana because I knew it literally days after Vipassana. So
wow.
and I should correct myself. I think I referred to you as the center manager currently, just to correct that. You're the center teacher at the Vipassana Center in Tasmania. Going on with your story and just jumping to from your first course, I assume you can become more actively involved and are taking more courses and be involved in the community. Fast forward to when you decided to go to Myanmar and what drove you to want to go there, and your first impressions upon landing and starting to spend some time in the country.
Yeah. Well, I first very nearly went to Myanmar in 2006. I'd been long-term serving at Dharmagiri in India. And it was known amongst meditators there that Goenkaji's sons had connections with with being able to connect meditators with visas to Myanmar. And so I very nearly spontaneously applied for a visa to go to Myanmar. However, my original plans after leaving Dharmagiri were to do the actual Buddha Yatra throughout India. And so I decided to keep to my plans very reluctantly. I had a very strong pull then to want to go to Myanmar for obvious reasons, but I did end up doing the Yatra instead. And then it wasn't for another 6 years later, and my husband and I had been living in New Zealand for some time, and we'd taken, both of us, 2 years off the Dharma long-term service lifestyle to earn some more money in his hometown in New Zealand. And we ended up getting quite involved with the community and felt that we'd strayed somewhat from our true path, and decided at that point that we wanted to return to full-time Dharma sitting and serving, and thought, well, the best way to do that would be to finally fulfill both of our dreams and go and sit a long course in Burma. So we first travelled together to Burma in late 2012 to sit a 30-day course at Dhammanidhi.
Right. So your first experience of being in Burma was being whisked into a 30-day course. And then did you, after the course, did you have much time to explore the country?
Well, actually, we joined the last yatra, that the Vipassana yatra that they held in Burma before Goenkaji died. So we went straight to Dhamma-jyoti in Yangon and set off on the yatra from there. Attended a few venues in Yangon with Goenkaji, and of course that was the year before he died. So it was that was some of his last public appearances, which were very inspiring. So then set off on the yatra, and I guess this is the interesting part, because we joined the yatra, we left Yangon, the yatra went up into the far north, Mandalay, and of course all the respective areas related to our tradition. And we were at the Webu Sayadaw Monastery in Wanyua, and Jamie and I decided at that point that we wanted to leave the yatra and go to Ingyinbin. We'd heard some things about Ingyinbin, but we didn't know an awful lot about it, just that it was, of course, the Webu Sayadaw Monastery, and decided that that's where we needed to be. So we did that. And we're very grateful we did, because we've continued to return to Ingyinbin for the following five trips we made to Myanmar after that.
That's great. I think our paths were crisscrossing then, even if we didn't know it. I was at Shui Min Monastery at the time during that yatra, but I came into the city to see his talk in National Theater, and then also went down to Seathaji's village when they were visiting there,
Yeah,
and
okay.
and was just present there. And then, but the really interesting thing is that I'd have to check the dates. I don't remember exactly when it was, but it was right around that time that I ended up in Ingyinbin with Uaga, a friend who's a Dutch monk,
Yeah.
and this what's now become kind of like an infamous, I would call it an amateur documentary of Webu Sayadaw, kind of an accidental documentary, was made there, and that was where we. And that's actually the thing that set off on everything I've been doing since, kind of accidentally.
Of
We were
course.
we were at Ingyinbin around that time, and somehow Umandala had been given a scanner, and we had no idea why he had it. He didn't really know why he had it, but we thought, well, let's scan all these old pictures, these archival pictures of Webu Sayadaw, and just be able to preserve them in some way and share them with communities outside. And that scanning project turned into like, well, why don't we make a slideshow instead of a, just putting them in a file. And then the slideshow became, well, why don't we have this chanting, we have this bit of discourse, here's an archival like World War II footage from Burma that fits in with, the events we're trying to tell. And it became this kind of 6-week, I would call it amateur documentary that started everything I've done since then. So just a kind of crisscrossing your timeline. So anyway, I don't mean to take the spotlight. You're on your pilgrimage, and you veer off the pilgrimage to you're drawn to Ingyinbin. And so, what was that experience like? How did you feel coming to the monastery, and how did you spend your time there?
Oh, it was incredible, really, from beginning to end. We didn't even really know how to get there. We'd been told if we went to Shwebo, we'd be able to get a motorcycle taxi out to Ingyinbin, because apparently then that was the only way to get there. And we ended up meeting an absolutely delightful young local man when we arrived at the hotel there, and he quickly established that we were Vipassana meditators, and he'd only just self-taught himself enough English to have a reasonable conversation with us, and then of course offered to take us out. He had my husband on the back of his motorbike, and he got his wife to put me on the back of her motorbike, and they took us out to Ingyinbin and introduced us to Umandala, and our friendship, has remained with that young man to this day. I don't know if you know Ko Chaukse, I think. So we arrived at Ingyinbin and met Umandala, and of course, as everyone knows, he completely welcomed and embraced us into his monastery there. And we were only able to stay for 3 days, but they were the first of very many, amazing days with our time at Ingyinbin with Umandala.
And of all the places you went to in Myanmar, not just the normal tourist places, but places that are steeped in meditation history, and some of the great Sayadaws and meditation teachers have been. Ingyinbin was one that not just pulled you to want to come, but when you were actually there, it seemed to even fulfill you and give you more than even what you were anticipating. So, what was it specifically about that site that you found so compelling and so powerful to want to come back and keep spending time?
Yeah, well, I have to say that it was the Patipati Monastery, of course. Being within the grounds of the Patipati Monastery, I always said and say to this day, felt like the most peaceful place on earth, which, of course, many would find hard to believe in the current climes. But stepping inside that monastery, we would spend obviously many hours a day meditating in Webu Sayadaw's kuti, and it just, I guess, whether it was simply the presence of a past arahant having lived there, but I used to say to my husband all the time, my goodness, if there were anywhere I could spend the rest of my days, it would be here. So it was just a feeling that is very hard to describe, but I'm sure anyone who's been there will know that feeling. And of course, we developed a very close relationship with Umandala over the times too. So we would always stay with him and but spend our days in the Padipadi grounds meditating.
Right, and I think that also just really speaks to the generosity of spirit. Just those two examples, a microcosm of that. The young man in the Webu Hotel that personally, as strangers, personally takes you to this remote monastery, and then Umandala, initially again as a stranger, just welcoming you with open arms and caring for you, and just a display of how welcoming and inviting and really unconditional giving you find, especially as a meditator and going there.
Well, Umandala always said to us that he felt that it was his mission to welcome Western meditators to his monastery because, of course, the Webu Sayadaw had given the prophecy that busloads of Western tourists would come in the future, and so he foresaw our arrival and many other meditators. And of course, as the years progressed, many more meditators continued to come to the monastery, and he saw that as a fulfillment of the Webu Sayadaw's prophecy.
Yeah, of course. It's been great seeing that on the map more and more. Actually, for the Meditators Guidebook we wrote, we went and tracked down most probably the first Western meditator that visited Ingyinbin and put it on the map. I mean, aside from a few that were there during Webu Sayadaw's time, and that was Luke Matthews, a teacher in Canada, and he told me in quite a bit of detail that they had some vague understanding of where it was, and just the trials and tribulations of actually getting there is such an adventure, so difficult. And so whatever kind of difficulties we all have in trying to get there or track it down, it's just funny looking back on the recent history of when it was truly off the map and really it was almost like a mythology, almost like, it's somewhere around this X, but I have no idea where, and I don't know who to ask, and I don't know how to get there. And then once he found it and started sharing to a few more people and a few more people, and it got a bit more firmly on the map for all of us.
Yeah. Although I know now, when you enter Kenu and start to travel towards Ingyinbin, you see that pagoda spire in the distance rising up through the palm trees, and it it's a very prominent landmark. Almost a beacon.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And so then in your time, you keep going back to Myanmar, you keep going back to this very remote village that most Burmese have probably never heard of, let alone been to, and spending more and more time there. And eventually you make a decision on one visit to ordain as a nun. So tell us a bit about that.
Yes, of course. So as an assistant teacher at that time in the tradition of Goenka's vipassana, I asked my teacher if it would be okay if I ordained temporarily, and I was, of course, given permission. And so, before, in my early years of vipassana, my goal was to ordain. I think I've always had the monastic sankhara, so to speak. And then, of course, I ended up becoming, marrying my husband. And but I guess the seed of monasticism has always been there. So it just felt so right to fulfill that aspiration with Umandala at the Ingyinbin monastery. And I actually ordained twice. So the first time was for 3 weeks. And then a couple of years later, it was for 5 weeks. So just for short stints. But they were truly, truly amazing times.
And how did you find differences between doing the meditation as doing the practice as a nun wearing robes in Myanmar versus being a lay practitioner? Was there a difference in those two when you were contrasting those two different experiences?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, even though meditators in Myanmar, meditator yogis in Myanmar are supported and highly respected by the local Burmese people. I mean, there's a significant difference between being a tourist in Myanmar and being a yogi in Myanmar alone. You're recognised as such and supported greatly by the people for practicing meditation. But then to take robes was a whole new level altogether, because I found that as meditators, as lay meditators, we're aiming to develop our practice to be able to develop wisdom towards ultimate reality, rather so much as apparent reality. And then I found as a nun that it was almost expected that we live into the ultimate reality. The monastic tradition in Myanmar, that, the monastics are not considered as, termed as people. They're noble ones, and they're
Right.
treated to support them to live into that ultimate reality, the ultimate reality of anatta, anicca. And so I felt that expectancy almost, not to identify myself in the apparent reality, rather in the ultimate reality, it strengthened my scope of practice. I mean, we have that opportunity when we sit long courses 10 days, of course, and long courses in the Vipassana tradition. And I would still say that sitting long courses in the Vipassana tradition is definitely, for me, the ultimate way to live into that ultimate reality, because still as a nun, of course, you have your daily responsibilities. But nonetheless, it was a profound inner experience, a very personal experience, I guess, that is hard to describe.
Right. And that's looking at contrasting the actual experiences of meditation, just sitting down on the cushion, wearing one set of clothing versus another, and the way that actually impacts the practice. Zooming out a little bit and looking at the wider scope of the environments. You came from the Vipassana Center, which is more of a lay organization and more geared towards lay life, and I would say modern life as well. Although it's obviously predicated on not just monastic culture, but specifically Burmese monastic culture. I would say where it came out of. And you went from being a part more of the lay organization and that culture to a Burmese monastic environment, and then back again. And you actually went back and forth several times. So what did you find as in that journey going back and forth from one to the other, where the Dhamma is present in both, the ultimate goal is really the same, the method for practicing and the ideology and the same set of beliefs are there, and yet there's also very extraordinary differences between them as well and how they're constructed. So being able to go back and forth in both and be somewhat comfortable, I imagine, in both as well in terms of integrating, but integrating in different ways. What did you find as those differences and similarities between those two sets of environments?
Yeah, well, I guess primarily as a wife. My husband was incredibly supportive. He was actually my kapia, because I took the 10 precepts not to handle money as well. So, he was doing that side of things for me and supported me greatly in the role. I mean, of course, obviously, because it was temporary. We had both spoken. It was interesting to note, actually, that after that first trip in 2012, we had both carefully considered ordaining prior to returning home. And we returned back to New Zealand, and it was at that point that the centre teacher there actually asked us to become ATs. So our life very, very nearly took a completely different path. But we felt that it was our role, I guess, in this life to serve the Dharma in the way that we have since together as ATs, and that this is the time to help propagate and spread Dharma in this way, and that perhaps we do both have had lifetimes as monastics, but in this life we were to come together and serve in this capacity together. And so after my second ordination, I felt like I'd done what I needed to do. Since since disrobing after the second ordination, I knew then that I wouldn't be doing it again in this life. That I'd fulfilled some need within me that needed to be fulfilled, and very happily closed that experience in my life.
Right, and looking at the actual the places themselves, that you could say the culture, the organizations of going from a lay meditation center to a Burmese monastic environment, how would you contrast like the similarities between them and the differences and the adjustments that had to be made in moving back and forth?
Yeah, none at all, I would say, actually, because, Burmese monasteries are very accommodating, and at least the ones we stayed in were quite happy for us to practice as we liked, when we liked. We were free to come and go and do our own thing. We certainly didn't take teachings from the Sayadaws there. And so we would basically keep the course daily timetable while we were staying at monasteries, and meditate and take meals at the usual times, because monastic meal times are pretty much the same as course meal times. So because we'd been spending, the following years we continued to live our entire life serving centres full time. We actually didn't have our own householder's life, so to speak, outside of a centre. We moved from centre to centre around New Zealand and Australia, and basically sat and served long term. So the two environments were very similar, and it didn't take much adapting at all for us, because we continued to just do the same thing at the monasteries that we would normally do at a centre anyway.
Yeah, that's great. Coming from that monastic experience and the overall experience in Myanmar as a meditator, and then going back into the Goenka Vipassana tradition, were there specific lessons or things that you learned or gained from Myanmar that you found yourself applying or acting out naturally that you can look at as, before you came to Myanmar, even as a meditator, you weren't quite grasping it or internalizing it to the same depth, and then after you had those experiences became more a part of your practice or your life?
I think just being truly inspired and truly grateful for the lineage of teachers, and to really, it was very enriching engaging with the Sayadaws that we spent time with. I think it was, on the one hand, they got to learn more about what it meant for a Western meditator in the Goenkaji tradition to be in Burma, equally as much as it was for us to learn deeply where our tradition had come from. But overall, I can speak for my husband Jamie as well. We just felt like we knew Myanmar. It didn't seem like a foreign place to us, to be honest. We felt completely at home there. We felt completely familiar with both monastic and lay life in Myanmar. And other than taking the inspiration that we gained from spending time there back to the West and back to life in centres in the West, it only enriched our experience.
Right. Is there any particular anecdote or experience that stands out from your time in Myanmar that you might like to share here?
Well,
I'm sure a lot. A lot to choose from.
I have to say that I think one of the highlights, I was in robes at the time too, actually, and we had developed a friendship with U Aga. We sat long courses with him, or at least one 45-day course with him in Burma, and it was on one of our last trips. I think it was actually our last trip to Myanmar, and we contacted U Aga to find out where he was and how he was, and he was spending time on his 6-month retreat down in the south of Myanmar, south of Dawe. And we'd never gone into the far south of Burma, and he invited us down to the monastery where he was spending his retreat down there, a true forest monastery. So we travelled took a horrendous 15-hour bus ride from Yangon down to where he was staying, and ended up spending about 2 weeks down there. He had his own kuti in the forest, and there were 2 empty kutis there. So Jamie stayed in one and I stayed in another, and we had to walk half an hour, I think 20 minutes, half an hour through the forest down to the monastery to collect our alms, our food each day, and walk back up into the forest. And we all sat a Satipatthana self-course there together in our respective kutis. And as I say, I was in robes at the time, and I have to say that was probably, one of the most beautiful things that we've done in Burma.
That's beautiful imagery that you present of down there. And I also haven't been there, but I was aware when he went, and he regaled me with all sorts of stories from his experiences as well. But what, aside from how you've already described it and that the evocative imagery, what made it stand out so profoundly among all the other experiences you had? What was so special about that particular memory and that particular self-course?
I think it was the isolation and the opportunity to really practice as a forest monastic. Because as I say, as a monastic in some of the bigger monasteries, it was a very social affair, to be honest. Even though we were meditating so many hours a day, we were still speaking and integrating with people, and of course that was expected, so and of course there were always other meditators coming and going, and it was a very social affair. But the experience down there was full immersion into forest monasticism. I was completely isolated in my kuti, as Uaga and Jamie were. There was no electricity, there was no running water. We had to collect our own water from the river, and that sense of isolation for me personally is just heaven. To really, really, I always feel like I'm just kind of having a go at things in other monasteries, but there's always the distractions and so forth. As strong as that underlying energy is in those monasteries, but this was a true, although short, but true forest living experience. And of course we were sitting a self-course, so there was silence and absolutely no interaction with others. And also being in robes and having, we would walk down in a line together, Uaga first and then me and Jamie behind, and silently collect our alms. I'd never had the opportunity before to collect alms, of course, as a nun at the other monasteries. We would join meal times with everyone else and sit down and talk and then carry on. But, this way I was actually receiving alms and taking them back to the kuti to eat in silence. And so that was an experience like none other. Of course, once again, the sitting courses in the vipassana tradition and particularly long courses give you that opportunity entirely. But I got that plus robes.
Right, and also in a forest, basically on your own. So, I mean, this is really hearkening back to the actual days of the Buddha, where it's very hard to live like this today, but you're actually modeling a life there that's not all that different from how you hear in some of those early stories of the Buddha's own life and his teachings and his followers.
Entirely. In fact, there was one experience, the middle of one night, where I woke to the strangest sound. I can't describe, and I still don't know what it was. It was not an animal, and it was not a person, but it was a very strange wailing sound. And I was unnerved to the point where I almost thought about running and grabbing my husband in the kuti a few hundred meters away. However, I decided to sit and play the Tikapatana. But I imagine, and of course the sound died away, and the feeling of being threatened in any way died with that too. And I imagine that and I was grateful for that experience, because I imagined that, the monks of old meditating in forests would have had to have encountered those sorts of experiences all the time.
It's really amazing to have those living experiences, especially when you have a knowledge of some of the stories. It reminds me of many years ago when I was at Sayataji Center and sitting a self-course by myself, and I was alone in the center at night, just sitting. And I think I was hearing something scattering around, and I assumed it was a rat or a mouse, and was getting a bit unnerved as how close the sound was and where it was coming and if it would come to me. And because I had been reading some of Sayataji's biography and history, I recall the story of where at that very same place, in that very same building, an episode where Sayataji was sitting. And as one knows that center, and as one knows just Burmese architecture in general and how houses are built, that you have the floor of many of the huts can be several feet off the ground, and or you could even have like the floor, and then below the floor you have some rafters below that. And so as he's sitting, he looks down under his crossed legs and through the rafters of the floor, and he sees this giant snake that's curled up and immediately has this fear of being bitten by the snake, but then has this realization of wisdom coming with it, that whatever kind of fear, terror, or danger that the snake could possibly give by biting was in no way comparable to the fear and the danger of all the past lifetimes and all of samsara, and the danger of samsara, and the sense of samvega awoke in him. Samvega being this kind of falling away of a disinterest in the world for seeing the what samsara really is, and that had him ardently return to a sitting practice. And so this memory reminded me that in this very same place where I'm getting a little concerned about rats or mice, there's a snake under Sayataji, in this very same building where I am now 100 years ago. And just that, bringing that story to mind, just made this kind of firmer resolution. And I think that kind of, I don't know if you can call it adventure Dhamma or real life Dhamma, or just something, the meditation centers are wonderful in the kind of focus and isolation they provide, but to be able to have that training and then go and apply it in a more dynamic situation where things happen that are unusual or unexpected, that can just be a whole different experience on the spiritual path of meditation, for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. As you say, the comfort of a meditation center provides a lot of security. Whereas, when you're out there in the jungle, there's other things that strengthen your practice as well.
Yeah. So moving on to looking at the past year, of course, the coup that happened last year, the military coup in Myanmar on February 1st. And it's just been so devastating for Burmese everywhere, for friends of the country, for expats who've lived there, and certainly for the meditator practitioner community, including those who have lived there, those who have visited there, and even those that have never even been, but are just beneficiaries of a Burmese lineage like Goenka or like so many others, to realize this devastation going on in a country that has just given so much. What's been your feeling? How have you been following the events going on and responding, and how have you been working with it?
Well, when it first happened, I was almost obsessed with what was going on. I felt like it was a way of perhaps, I guess like all of us, I felt so helpless, that there was absolutely nothing we could do, but I couldn't turn away from it. And so I was watching everything that happened there, and even, the horrifying footage that was coming out of it, because I felt like it was a responsibility to, it was just, I guess a way of escaping the feeling of helplessness. But I became so devastated and truly so distraught that I actually had to pull back from doing that. I guess reach out to the expat Burmese that friends that that I have living in Australia and abroad, and trying to support them in any way. But really overall, just a sense of absolute, I mean, you can imagine the gamut of emotions. We've all felt them, but, still to this day, I feel such a sense of helplessness, I guess.
Yeah, and it's really, even in this conversation, it's such a contrast to go from these beautiful, warm lessons that are not just nestled in nonviolence, but are nestled in the ultimate peace and liberation and non-harm to all beings, to go from that kind of conversation to to looking at just horrors of possible genocides and crimes against humanity, and that this is happening, and this is all happening in the same place to the same people. It can kind of defy imagination in a way.
It does, exactly, yeah.
So as the time has gone on and there was this initial shock, how, and you mentioned following the news very carefully and then having to pull back a bit, how have you learned to live with it, or how have you learned to moderate your practice and your engagement and to find that balance?
Yeah. Well, I have to sit with those feelings when they occur, of course, and extending the merits and the benefits of our own peaceful lives here in Australia to the people in Burma through metta. I know of not many other ways to really provide support from so far, but if time and space, I don't think time and space matters so much. You can be very close to people in meditation. And so I try to extend my support through my practice of metta, and of course in any other material way that I possibly can.
Right. I think that's all that all of us are trying to do, no matter where our walk of life is. And that's also why I think discussions like this are important. I think equally important is to be informed and bear witness, even those very painful things that could even bring us some kind of trauma or nightmare, even being in a place of safety learning, but just as a responsibility to not turn away. But I think those stories are important, but equally important are knowing that I think that Myanmar has always been, at least from what I've seen, it's run the risk of being portrayed as this one-dimensional place in outside news and coverage. And so I think stories like this really help to remind just how vibrant and alive and giving so much of the society is, and that it's not just a place where bad things happen. It's so much more than that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you can't really know that unless you've been there.
Right. And not just been there, but in the case of you and so many others, have been exposed to these certain parts of the society that many tourists and expats don't. So getting that much richer and more authentic view of how at least some of the people live. It's obviously there's a lot of ethnicities and religions and cultures that are there. Buddhism is just one of them. But for those that have experienced Bamar Buddhism or other types of Buddhism as a practitioner, that's it's definitely something that stays with one.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for taking the time to join and share these experiences. They're really heartwarming and wonderful to keep in mind, especially at a time like this.
Thank you, Joa, and continue the good work you're doing. It's a wonderful thing.
Thanks for joining us for today's episode. Being a small, mostly volunteer team, our production time for a single episode before the coup was sometimes as long as 4 months from start to finish. While we had worked at decreasing the lead time, the fastest we were ever able to manage was just around 3 weeks. Yet during this current crisis, where even a single day's event can produce such shocking news and urgent needs, we simply don't have this luxury of time. So we've worked around the clock to substantially shorten the length of our production cycle. The turnaround for some episodes now has been just 36 hours. However, we can't accomplish this goal without your support. If you found value in today's episode and think that others may also benefit from this type of content, please consider making a donation so that we can continue our mission. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go to support a wide range of humanitarian missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person, IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and much more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution for a specific activity or project you would like to support. Perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian aid work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org. That's BETTERBURMA.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit cards. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either the Insight Myanmar or Better Burma websites for specific links to those respective accounts, or email us at info@betterburma.org. If you'd like to give it another way, please contact us. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Bharale tan man pran